Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. This next story is about a 25-year-old British mountaineer who climbed up Siula Grande in one of the mountain ranges of Peru. He was with his friend, Simon Yates, who was only 21 years old then. Coming from a very challenging and life-threatening ascent, they had just started to descend when he suddenly fell off an ice cliff and got badly injured. With his right leg twisted, fractured heel and ankle, nerves and ligaments badly affected, it was impossible for him to continue with the descent. Help was nowhere near either. Thus, Simon Yates strapped him to his waist and began to lower him down the cliff using all their ropes knotted together. An hour later, Simon cut the rope, dropping him into 100 feet free fall. He bumped on the edge of a crevasse and then fell into it, landing another 20 meters beneath. This is Joe Simpson's horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. In 1985, in the Peruvian mountain ranges, Joe Simpson decided to attempt making a world record of being the first to conquer Siula Grande's west face. Together with Simon Yates, they climbed the 6,344-meter-high mountain, the Alpine style. The Alpine style is a fast-paced climb up the peak of a mountain, usually medium-sized ones, bringing very minimal equipment and supplies to ensure a light load all throughout the climb. Quite the opposite of the expedition style, where mountaineers climb in a slow and steady manner, setting up camps on their journey to the summit and leaving their heavy equipment and supplies at the camp. Their climb was off to a good start, having passed the glaciers and spending the night on a rocky part of the mountain before starting their official ascent to the summit. Early the next morning, they had quite a bit of a challenging ascent, but it was still manageable. However, as they got closer to the peak, 400 feet away to be exact, the temperatures dropped drastically, and a snowstorm suddenly came up, making it almost impossible to reach the peak without freezing. It took them around 1 hour to conquer the last 150 feet to the summit, but thankfully, and with much struggle, they did. The two were overcome with joy and euphoria by the thought that they can now tick that off their bucket list, the first one to conquer Siula Grande's west face. This gave them an extra boost of energy despite being exhausted and freezing. Since the weather had not been cooperating with this once-in-a-lifetime moment, they began their descent in no time, and they had to do it as quickly as possible before the still raging snowstorm freezes them to death. Visibility was pretty low, so Joe and Simon had to tie themselves loosely using one of the few ropes they brought with them. They have already covered 1/3 of the way down. He thought of warning Simon, who was following his trail, to be careful not to fall over as they approached an ice cliff. But as Joe stuck his right axe into it, the ice suddenly broke off, and the very danger that he feared would happen to Simon happened to him instead. He fell, and he fell badly. Falling flat at the base of the cliff, Joe's right leg got twisted. Because he wore crampons, the metal plates with spikes normally attached to boots when climbing on ice, it worsened the impact of his fall. His tibia smacked right up to his femur. His anterior cruciate ligament, a vital ligament in the knee, got torn. His peroneal nerve and the two meniscus in the knee were damaged. Not to mention, he also sustained fractures on his heel and ankle. Joe was in deep, excruciating pain. He tried to stand up and condition his mind to keep going, but as soon as Simon rushed to where he was and learned he had broken his leg, Simon's heart sank. They both knew things had just gotten worse. They still had 3,000 feet left to go. Joe is now starting to lose a lot of blood, and by getting him to walk the whole 3,000 feet down, to say it's impossible would even be an understatement. Left with no other choice, Simon tied all the ropes together so he could lower Joe down to the foot of the mountain. Each rope was around 150 feet long, so for every 150 feet, a knot connecting both ends of each rope would be caught up in Simon's friction device. Once Joe feels the brief stop of each knot, he would look around from where he was hanging and grab something to keep his weight off the rope, giving Simon a few seconds to unclip and transfer the knot on the other side of the friction device. Simon will then pull the rope 3 times, alerting Joe on the other end that he is now ready, and proceed to lower him down again until the next knot. They did this over and over again until they had already covered 300 feet in 1 hour. At this rate, since the bottom of the mountain was 3,000 feet from where they began, it would take them 10 hours doing the same cycle before they reached the bottom. Stamina and strength in the midst of freezing temperatures were enough concern for Simon, but Joe approaching an ice cliff was another. It was already 9:30 in the evening. Simon managed to move Joe over to the edge of the ice cliff so he could continue lowering him down. Shortly after, Simon stopped. Probably another knot has reached his friction device. Joe was only 100 feet above the surface, and as he glanced, he saw a crevasse underneath him. With nowhere to hold onto to lighten the load, Simon bore Joe's entire weight and no longer had the strength to unclip his friction device and transfer the knot. Simon struggled to hold on, but as each minute passed, he got weaker and weaker until the unimaginable happened. An hour later, Simon could no longer endure it, knowing both their lives were now in serious danger if he dragged on. He remembered that the only pocket knife they brought was in his backpack, so he reached for it and decided to cut the rope. On the other end of the rope, clueless of the decision-making that happened 2,700 feet above him, Joe went on a free fall, hitting the corner of the crevasse and plunged right into it. He found himself around 70 feet under the opening and thought Simon might have fallen along with him as well. Hoping he could use Simon as a counterweight on the other end, he pulled the rope to get himself out of the crevasse, but the other end of the rope fell down on him. It was then that he realized that Simon cut the rope. Instead of getting furious and feeling betrayed over what Simon did, surprisingly, Joe felt a sense of relief and a little hope that Simon would come down quickly to look for him. But this spark of hope was also very easily extinguished. It was already pitch black, and with his current location, it was impossible for Simon to find him. So Joe figured he should shout Simon's name every 5 minutes, shouting loudly to the best of his ability. After a while, he fell asleep. Meanwhile, Simon passed by the area and even tried to peek into the crevasse to check if Joe might have possibly landed into it. But the crevasse was just too dark for him to see what was beneath. Simon tried calling Joe's name, but he heard no response. After some time, he decided to go on his way back to camp, fearing the worst had happened to his friend. At around 9:30 the next morning, Joe woke up and thought he should have been found by that time, but there was no sight nor sound of Simon being around the area. Feeling helpless but unwilling to give up, Joe attempted to climb up but failed. However, beneath him was complete darkness. Apparently, the crevasse that Joe fell into was a bergschrund, which is formed when the moving ice of a glacier begins to separate from the non-moving glacier or the base of a mountain. It can range between 50 to 500 feet deep, so Joe did not want to just leap into the dark. After all, he's had enough falls already. Instead, he got his abseil device so he can start lowering himself down and intentionally did not tie a knot at the end of the rope. Upon reaching 70 feet down, he saw a 65-degree slope of snow, most probably built up by avalanches. He thought he could hop his way through the snow in order to get out of the crevasse. At that point, his main goal wasn't really to survive. He resolved that if he was just going to die anyway, he'd rather die under the sunlight than die stuck in that dark crevasse. It had already been 1 in the afternoon when Joe literally saw light. He was finally out of the crevasse and under the heat of the sun. Looking around, he saw Simon's rope on the left, signifying that Simon had rappelled down the glacier. Then finally, it dawned on him. He was on his own. The base camp was still 8 miles away from where he was, and distance wasn't the only issue. Getting back to base meant 1.5 miles of glacier and 6.5 miles of moraines, huge bunches of rocks, sediments and remnants from a glacier. Overwhelmed by the realization that his ordeal is far from over, with still quite a long road before him and his body almost giving up on him, he knew he wasn't going to make it. Yet again, the thought of dying in the middle of nowhere, being covered in snow and no one ever knowing what happened, gave Joe another push to keep going. So for the next 3.5 days, he crawled his way, and you can only imagine his struggle. This man who literally came from great heights now had to crawl on the ground, continuing to press on and fight for his dear life, or at least escape the kind of death he did not want for himself. What kept him going were the small goals he set for himself, such as reaching another crevasse in 20 minutes or getting to a red rock in another 20 minutes, one crawl at a time. He didn't hit his target at all times, but it kept him from getting distracted into thinking all is lost. It has been 4 days by then since he and Simon started the climb. He has started to lose all his senses, having gone for 3 days with little to no food at all. He was only 10 minutes away from the base camp, but it took him 9 hours to get through the last stretch. He was also beginning to have hallucinations and oftentimes lost consciousness, but after a while would regain it. Joe knew he was already dying, so with the last ounce of strength, he shouted for help, taking all the chances left that Simon and Richard, their camp assistant, were still there and that they would hear his cry for help. Back at the camp, Simon and Richard heard a sound from a distance, but they thought it was just a dog and did not care much about it. He felt utterly hopeless and thought he was right all along. This was the end of him. So many thoughts came rushing through his mind as he tried to picture out how he wanted to die. Thoughts like getting into his sleeping bag to pass peacefully in his sleep, or crawling to the riverside hoping somebody will come and discover his body. A little while later, as Joe continued to crawl with no clear direction, he accidentally crawled on human feces. Ironically, the smell was so awful that it brought Joe back to his senses. At that moment, he realized where he was and knew that the area where they pitched their tents was just 100 yards away. Again, he tried shouting and calling for help but thought to himself, Simon and Richard must have already cleared the area. After all, Simon might have also needed immediate medical help. However, a few seconds later, much to Joe's surprise, a white ray of light shone on him. Then he heard a familiar voice. He looked toward the direction of where the voices was coming from. It was Simon and Richard rushing to him. Joe passed out at the sight and idea of being found finally. Here was Joe completely drained, having used up all the adrenaline he had in the last 4 days as he successfully crawled his way back to base, already under the care of Simon and Richard. He can now finally rest from trying to survive, as his body has been in full blast fight or flight mode in the past few days. Moments later, Simon caught the smell of Joe's breath and immediately identified that Joe was about to enter into a state of starvation ketoacidosis, a metabolic state where your liver produces chemicals called ketones that break down muscles and organs when the body goes on an extended period of time without food. Normally, in this case, one's breath can smell like the smell of a nail varnish remover, commonly known as acetone. Alarmed and running out of time, Simon immediately took Joe. However, the only mode of transportation they had going out of the base camp was a mule. It took them a total of 2 days on the mule and 23 hours riding a pickup truck. After 11 grueling days, Joe finally got the medical attention he badly needed. Joe lost 35% of his body weight and suffered from extreme frostbite. He had to undergo a total of 6 surgeries, had to be on strict bed rest, and took 2 full years to completely recover. Only 7 weeks after the incident, Joe started to write his very own story of his close call with death. Entitled Touching the Void, he narrates every detail about his ordeal. Many found Simon to be selfish and strongly believed that what he did was an act of betrayal. But when asked if he ever felt angry at Simon, Joe's answer was a strong and firm no. He's even thankful Simon turned out to be alive, but had it not been for him, Joe would have been left to die there without anyone knowing. As Joe puts it, if he were to be in Simon's shoes, he would have done the same, and even wondered why it took Simon more than an hour to cut the rope. Away with the cliches, Joe Simpson was quite frank about what this horrifying experience taught him, and it wasn't the usual inspirational or motivational speeches he spoke of in front of the climbing community and in his speaking engagements after. His near-death experience taught him 3 things. First, he doesn't ever want to know how he would die. Second, he and Simon were pretty good mountaineers for having been able to come out of that alive. And lastly, it made him realize that he could write and speak in front of a crowd. Now Joe makes a living out of his story and he still continues to climb. Joe Simpson made being an author and speaker his full-time job. This is how it changed his life. Thank you for making it this far. We appreciate all your support. If you haven't, please click on the subscribe button and like this video. It means a lot to us. Feel free to drop story suggestions in the comments below. Once again, thank you and we'll see you in the next one.